The courtroom was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the heavy kind. The kind that presses against your chest until breathing feels like work. She stood there alone, 7 months pregnant, hands resting on her stomach. No lawyer beside her, no family behind her. Across the room, the man who once promised to protect her was asking the court to erase her existence. The judge glanced at the paperwork, lifted his pen, and prepared to end it all. That's when the door opened, and a calm voice said, "Excuse me, Your Honor. I believe this court is about to make a mistake." Every head turned. No one knew yet that the man who had just entered was not only her father, but the most dangerous person in that room. The judge adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the paperwork again, the pages whispering softly as he turned them. The sound felt unbearably loud to Emily, like the tearing of fabric that could never be stitched back together. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, "before we proceed, I need to confirm. Have you been advised of your right to legal counsel?" Emily inhaled slowly through her nose. The air felt thin, sharp, like it didn't quite belong to her anymore. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you've chosen to proceed without representation." She hesitated, just for half a second, long enough for memories to rush in. The consultation rooms that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, the polite smiles that faded when she mentioned she didn't have access to joint accounts anymore, the hourly rates that might as well have been written in another language, the unspoken calculation behind every attorney's eyes. Can she pay? Is she worth the time? "I didn't choose it," she said finally. "It's just how things are." Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not enough that anyone else would comment on it later, but the judge looked at her again. Really looked this time, and his mouth tightened. "Very well," he said. "Mr. Carter's counsel, you may continue." The lawyer nodded, already standing again, confidence rolling off him like a tailored suit. "Thank you, Your Honor. Given the circumstances, my client believes it would be in everyone's best interest to resolve this matter efficiently. He is requesting primary custody considerations be deferred until after the child is born, with temporary financial support set at the statutory minimum." Emily's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. Temporary, minimum, deferred. Every word felt like a door quietly closing. The lawyer continued, his tone smooth, rehearsed. "My client has concerns regarding Mrs. Carter's emotional stability, given her current condition and the stress of pregnancy. He believes a structured, limited arrangement is appropriate until further evaluations can be conducted." Emily's heart slammed hard against her ribs. Emotional stability? She wanted to laugh or scream or stand up and ask him if waking up alone every morning, throwing up into an empty sink, and still dragging herself to work counted as unstable. If feeling your marriage die one cold, casual sentence at a time made you hysterical. If loving your unborn child so fiercely it hurt made you unfit. But she didn't do any of those things. She stayed still. The baby shifted again, a slow roll beneath her skin. She placed her hand there, without thinking, grounding herself in the warmth, the undeniable proof that something good still existed inside her. The judge looked over his glasses. "Mrs. Carter, would you like to respond to these statements?" Emily stood. Her legs trembled. Not enough to see, but enough that she felt it all the way up her spine. Standing made everything real in a way sitting hadn't. Standing meant she was visible, measured, judged. She glanced at Mark then, unable to stop herself. He still wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the table in front of him, jaw clenched, knuckles white. The man who once cried when he first heard the baby's heartbeat now looked like someone waiting for a delayed flight. Something inside Emily hardened. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. Her voice surprised even her, clear, steady, carrying farther than she expected. "I understand the court has procedures and guidelines and minimums." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I want the record to reflect that I did not abandon this marriage. I did not abandon this child. I have attended every medical appointment alone. I have paid for everything related to this pregnancy since my husband left our home." Mark's head snapped up. For the first time, their eyes met. There it was. Not love, not guilt, annoyance, as if she'd broken an unspoken agreement to stay quiet. Emily didn't look away. "I am employed," she continued. "I am stable, and while I may not have legal counsel, I am fully capable of caring for my child." Her chest tightened, emotion pressing hard against her throat. She swallowed it back. "What I'm asking for," she said, softer now, "is fairness, not just on paper, but in reality." Silence followed, heavy, dense. The judge leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. He studied her for a long moment, then glanced at Mark. "Mr. Carter," he said, "do you wish to respond?" Mark stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. The sound made Emily flinch. "I just want this to be over, that's all. I don't want to fight." Emily almost laughed again. "Of course you don't," she thought. "You already packed up your life and left." The judge exhaled slowly. "Divorce is not something that simply gets over, Mr. Carter, especially when a child is involved." Mark's shoulders stiffened. The judge turned back to Emily. "Mrs. Carter, given your pregnancy and lack of representation, I am not comfortable finalizing permanent arrangements today." Her breath caught. "I am ordering temporary support above the statutory minimum," he continued, ignoring the sharp inhale from Mark's attorney. "Additionally, I strongly recommend that you seek legal counsel before our next hearing. The court can provide a list of resources." Emily nodded, tears burning behind her eyes. Not because she'd won, this wasn't victory, but because someone had finally seen her. "As for custody," the judge concluded, "this court recognizes that motherhood does not begin at birth alone. We will revisit this after delivery with full consideration of the child's best interest." The gavel came down. The sound echoed through Emily's bones. When it was over, people began to move. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped. Lives continued. Mark left without a word. Emily remained standing for a moment longer, one hand on her stomach, the other pressed flat against her chest as she tried to remember how to breathe. She was still alone, but not invisible. And as she slowly gathered her things, she realized something else, something quiet, something fierce. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of the part where she stopped waiting for someone else to save her. Mark Carter hadn't always been like this, or at least that's what Emily used to believe. Memory had a way of softening sharp edges, of rounding corners that once cut deep. When Emily thought back to college, she remembered the laughter first, the easy way Mark smiled when he talked about his future, the certainty in his voice when he said things like, "I'm going to be someone," or "I don't settle for average." She mistook that certainty for safety. They met during her sophomore year in a crowded lecture hall that smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers. He sat beside her one day without asking, long legs stretched out, notebook untouched. "You're really focused," he'd said, amused, watching her scribble notes. "Someone has to be." she replied, not looking up. He liked that answer. Mark liked women who impressed him, women who made him feel chosen. Back then, Emily was exactly that. She didn't need him, not really, but she liked him. His ambition felt contagious. His confidence felt like something she could lean against when the world felt uncertain. He spoke of careers, houses, promotions, timelines. He made life feel organized, predictable. She didn't notice how often his plans centered around himself. When they married 3 years later, people said they were a perfect match. Mark, polished and driven, Emily, steady and warm. She balanced him, they said. What they didn't see was how much effort that balance took. When Emily told Mark she was pregnant, she had rehearsed the moment a dozen times. She imagined joy, surprise, maybe even tears. Instead, his smile froze, just for a second. A blink too long, a breath held too tightly. She noticed, but she ignored it. He hugged her, kissed her forehead, said, "We'll figure it out." He said all the right things. What he didn't say was how quickly fear was replacing love. Pregnancy changed things Mark hadn't prepared for. Emily grew quieter, but stronger. Her priorities sharpened. The small anxieties that once consumed her, work deadlines, social expectations, fell away. Something deeper took root. She no longer revolved around him, and Mark felt it. He felt the shift when Emily stopped asking his opinion on everything, when she chose practicality over aesthetics, when her body changed in ways he couldn't influence or direct. The attention shifted. The plans shifted. The money suddenly felt tighter, even though nothing had actually changed. And worst of all, Emily stopped needing him the way she used to. She was tired more often, focused inward, protective. The baby wasn't just growing inside her body, it was rearranging her entire emotional universe. Mark didn't know how to exist outside the center of it. That was when the late nights started. Meetings that ran long, phone calls taken in the car, texts answered with one-word replies. When Emily asked if something was wrong, he told her she was imagining things. "You're hormonal," he said once, casually, as if that explained everything. She stopped asking after that. The silence crept in quietly, the way mold does, slow, unnoticed, destructive. Meals eaten without conversation, television noise filling the space where intimacy used to live. Until one evening, while Emily sat on the couch folding impossibly small baby clothes, Mark stood in the doorway. She remembered the exact way the light hit him. Half-shadowed, detached. "I want a divorce." No apology, no explanation, just a decision. Emily didn't cry right away. She stared at the tiny onesie in her hands, white with pale blue stars, and waited for the words to make sense. Waited for him to say, "Just kidding," or "I'm scared," or "I don't know what I'm doing." But he didn't. 2 weeks later, he moved out. A month after that, he filed paperwork. And just like that, the life she thought she understood vanished. Mark believed he had calculated everything perfectly. Emily had no lawyer, no visible support system, no fight left in her. At least, none he could see. From where he sat in the courtroom now, he felt confident, relieved even. This was procedural, clean, controlled. He didn't look at Emily because looking made things messy. He preferred neat endings. As his attorney spoke, Mark leaned back slightly, arms folded. The bench was uncomfortable, but he barely noticed. He imagined the weeks ahead, final signatures, quiet evenings, freedom from responsibility he hadn't asked for. This would be over soon. What Mark didn't understand, what he had never understood, was that Emily's strength had never been loud. It was quiet, patient, and forged under pressure. While he was planning his exit, Emily had been surviving. She learned how to sleep alone, how to wake up at 3 in the morning with nausea and no one to help, how to sit through doctor appointments surrounded by couples and smile politely when nurses asked where her husband was. She learned how to swallow humiliation, how to calculate expenses, how to carry grief without letting it crush her. She learned that love could disappear and that she could still stand. By the time Emily walked into that courtroom, something in her had already shifted. She wasn't there to beg. She was there to protect. And Mark, still mistaking silence for surrender, had no idea that his confidence wasn't power, it was blindness. And it was about to cost him everything. Courtrooms don't just decide cases. They measure people. They weigh tone instead of truth, posture instead of pain, paper instead of lived experience. Emily could feel it happening to her in real time. The room was too bright, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, flattening everything beneath them. Faces, emotions, humanity. Even the wooden benches felt unforgiving, polished smooth by decades of quiet desperation. She stood still at the center of it all. Hands folded, back straight, chin lifted just enough. Not because she felt strong, but because she refused to look broken. Broken women were easy to dismiss. She felt the eyes before she consciously noticed them. The clerk's quick glance away when Emily shifted her weight, the subtle lean of the spectators, curiosity thinly veiled as concern. The unspoken narrative forming in the air. Pregnant, alone, unrepresented. They didn't know her name, but they thought they knew her story. Mark's lawyer spoke again, voice smooth, practiced, calibrated for persuasion. Your Honor, my client has consistently met his legal obligations. He has continued employment, stable housing, and is willing to comply with court-ordered child support once the child is born. Willing. The word settled heavily in Emily's chest. It sounded generous, cooperative, reasonable, but she knew what it really meant. Only when forced, only when required, only on paper. The lawyer continued without pause. Mrs. Carter, unfortunately, has no documented income at this time, no legal representation, and no clear plan for providing long-term stability. Emily felt something twist inside her, not sharp enough to be anger, not soft enough to be sadness, something heavier, more exhausting, because the words weren't entirely false, but they were incomplete. She had chosen to pause her career when the pregnancy became complicated, chosen rest over risk, chosen health over pride. She had savings, carefully rationed. She had plans scribbled into notebooks late at night when sleep wouldn't come. But plans didn't show up on balance sheets. Sacrifice didn't count as evidence. The lawyer sat back down, satisfied. The judge turned toward Emily. Mrs. Carter, he said, tone even, professional, distant. Do you have any evidence or statements you'd like to present before I rule? This was the moment. Emily felt it clearly as she felt her own heartbeat. This was the moment where people expected tears, where they braced for desperation, where they prepared to feel uncomfortable and then move on. She lifted her head. Yes, Your Honor, she said quietly. Her voice didn't echo, it didn't command the room, but it didn't waver. Mark finally looked at her, just briefly. His expression didn't change. Not surprise, not concern, just a faint tightening around his mouth, as if irritated by the inconvenience of her speaking. Emily didn't look away. I'd like the court to know that I never asked for this divorce. I never abandoned my family, and I never denied my child a future. Her hand pressed gently against her stomach, unconscious, instinctive. The baby moved, A slow, steady reminder that something real existed beneath all the legal language. Her voice stayed calm, but it cost her everything to keep it that way. I trusted my husband. I believed we were building something together, and now I'm standing here being told that my worth can be summarized in a few lines of paperwork. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't polite. It wasn't procedural. It was uncomfortable. A cough from the back row, a chair shifting, someone crossing and uncrossing their legs. The judge studied her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the file again, as if searching for something that wasn't there. "I understand your position, Mrs. Carter," he said finally. "However, this court must rule based on evidence and legal standards, not emotion." "Emotion?" Emily nodded. "I understand," she said. And she did. What the court didn't understand, what none of them could fully understand, was how much strength it takes for a woman to speak calmly while her life is being dismantled in public. She sat down slowly, carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter her composure. Her legs felt weak now, trembling beneath the weight of standing so long under scrutiny. She stared straight ahead. Didn't look at Mark, didn't look at his lawyer, didn't look at the spectators who would forget her face by evening. Inside, though, her thoughts raced. Is this how it happens? Is this how people decide who matters? She thought of the nights she lay awake counting breaths when panic threatened to take over, of the quiet conversations she'd had with her unborn child, apologies whispered into the dark for a world that already seemed so ready to judge. The judge began speaking again, outlining procedures, temporary arrangements, next steps. His voice blurred into something distant, mechanical. Emily caught fragments. Temporary. Guidelines. Further review. She focused instead on breathing. In. Out. Mark shifted beside his attorney, confidence returning now that the emotional part was over. This was the section he understood. Process, order, outcome. He liked things that fit into columns. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that something had shifted in Emily. Not loudly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. The assumptions in the room had failed to break her. They had clarified her. She understood now that the court wasn't built to protect the vulnerable, it was built to process them. That fairness required more than truth, it required proof. That silence would always be mistaken for weakness, and she would not be silent anymore. When the gavel finally came down, the sound echoed through the room like punctuation. People stood, gathered their things, returned to their lives. Emily remained seated for a moment longer, one hand on her stomach, one hand clenched in her lap. She wasn't crying, but she was grieving the version of herself who once believed being good, being patient, being loyal would be enough. She rose slowly and walked toward the exit. No one stopped her. No one offered comfort. And somehow that was okay, because as she stepped out of the courtroom and into the hallway beyond, Emily understood something with absolute clarity. They had measured her today, and they had underestimated her. As the judge began summarizing the terms of the divorce, Emily's world narrowed. The courtroom faded at the edges, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Words reached her ears, but they no longer landed where they were supposed to. Custody framework, financial guidelines, temporary arrangements. Each phrase felt less like a sentence and more like a door closing, solid, final, irreversible. She focused on the grain of the wooden table in front of her, the faint scratch near the edge, the way the surface had been worn smooth by years of hands gripping it in fear, hope, desperation. How many lives had been reshaped right here, in this exact spot? She glanced at Mark. He was relaxed now. Not openly smug, he was too careful for that, but comfortable, settled. One ankle resting casually over the opposite knee, his fingers drummed once against his folder, then stopped. This was confirmation, validation, proof that his calculations had been correct. Emily felt her baby shift again. Not sharp, not frantic, just a slow movement beneath her ribs, like a gentle nudge from the inside. "I'm here." Her throat tightened. She closed her eyes for just a second, and in that brief darkness, everything she hadn't said rushed forward. The nights she lay awake beside Mark, staring at the ceiling, while tears slid silently into her hair. The way she learned to cry without sound so he wouldn't roll over and sigh in irritation. The doctor's appointments she attended alone, sitting in plastic chairs while couples laughed nervously beside her. The polite smiles she offered when nurses asked, "Will your husband be joining us today?" The fear she swallowed every morning before standing up, steadying herself, pretending she wasn't terrified of doing all of this alone. She didn't speak. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's restraint. Sometimes it's the only way to survive without breaking apart in front of people who don't deserve to see your pain. The judge lifted his pen. "Based on the information presented, this court is prepared to grant the divorce under the terms—" The door opened. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft click. But the sound cut through the room like a blade. The judge stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned. A man stood in the doorway, mid-50s, well-dressed but not flashy, composed in a way that came from experience, not arrogance. He didn't rush, didn't apologize reflexively. He closed the door behind him and walked forward with measured steps, his eyes scanning the room, not searching, but assessing, taking everything in. The judge, the lawyers, Mark. Emily felt it before she truly saw him, a shift in the air, a grounding, something she hadn't felt in years. The man stopped beside her, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the familiar set of his shoulders, the quiet steadiness in the way he stood. And for the first time since the hearing began, Emily wasn't alone. He spoke calmly. "Your Honor," he said, "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe my presence is legally relevant." The judge frowned slightly, irritation flickering across his face before curiosity took its place. "And you are?" The man turned his head toward Emily, just slightly. His voice softened, just enough. "My name is Richard Carter," he said, "and I am her father." Emily's breath caught. The words didn't register all at once. They landed slowly, heavily, like stones dropping into water. Her father. The courtroom froze. No murmurs, no whispers, no shuffling of papers. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum more quietly. Mark's posture stiffened. The ease drained from his expression, replaced by something sharper, warier. He straightened in his chair, hands flattening against his thighs. He hadn't expected this. Richard Carter stood still, hands loosely at his sides. He didn't touch Emily, but his presence wrapped around her like a shield. Emily stared straight ahead, afraid that if she looked at him, she would lose control of herself completely. She hadn't seen him in years, not since the funeral, not since the silence that followed. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully, "this is a family court proceeding. May I ask why you are here today?" Richard nodded once, respectful, controlled. Of course, Your Honor, I am here because my daughter did not inform me of these proceedings until recently, and because I have reason to believe that the court does not currently have a full understanding of her circumstances. The judge's gaze flicked briefly to Emily. She felt exposed all over again. You were aware of this hearing? The judge asked her. Emily hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I didn't think it was appropriate to involve my father. Richard looked at her then. Not with accusation, not with disappointment, with something far more dangerous. Regret. The kind that comes from realizing you weren't there when you should have been. The judge leaned back slightly. Mr. Carter, he said, are you seeking to intervene in this matter? I am, Richard replied evenly, within the bounds of the law. Mark's attorney stood abruptly. Your Honor, with respect, this is highly irregular. The proceedings were already underway. And I interrupted, Richard said calmly, turning toward him. Yes, because timing should not outweigh truth. The room felt tighter now, charged. Emily's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her ears. The judge held up a hand. I will decide what is appropriate, he said firmly. He turned back to Richard. Go on. Richard took a breath. My daughter is not unrepresented because she is incapable. She is unrepresented because she chose to protect her health and her unborn child during a high-risk pregnancy. She has financial resources, familial support, including myself, and a documented work history that has not been presented today. Mark's jaw tightened. This court, Richard continued, has heard about what she lacks. It has not yet heard about what she has endured. Silence again, but this time it felt heavier. Emily finally turned her head. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There were years in that look. Distance, misunderstandings, unspoken apologies, and beneath all of it, love. The judge removed his glasses slowly. Mr. Carter, he said, this changes the scope of the hearing. Mark's attorney opened his mouth, then closed it again. The judge looked at Emily, really looked. Mrs. Carter, he said, I'm going to recess this hearing. When we resume, the court will allow additional documentation and representation. Emily's breath trembled as she exhaled. The gavel struck. This time, the sound didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a pause. As people began to move again, the room buzzing with restrained conversation, Emily remained seated. Richard turned fully toward her now. I'm here, he said quietly. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Her composure cracked, just slightly. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. For months, she had carried everything in silence. And now, standing in the aftermath of it all, she realized something she hadn't let herself believe before. Silence may have protected her, but being seen might finally save her. No one spoke. Not the judge, not the lawyers, not even the clerk whose fingers hovered frozen above the keyboard, mid-note, as if sound itself had become inappropriate. The man who had entered the courtroom stood quietly beside Emily, his hands folded behind his back. He wasn't imposing by size, he wasn't loud, he wasn't dramatic, and yet the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't sudden, like an explosion. It was gradual, subtle, like pressure redistributing itself in a sealed room. The judge leaned forward slightly. Mr. Carter, he said, choosing his words carefully, this hearing was already in progress. You'll need to explain why you're intervening now. Richard Carter nodded. Of course, Your Honor. He didn't rush, didn't sound defensive, didn't attempt to justify himself beyond the truth. I was not informed of the exact timing of today's hearing, he said calmly, but once I learned that my daughter was standing in court without representation, while 7 months pregnant, it felt it was my responsibility to be here. The word responsibility hung in the air, not obligation, not authority, responsibility. Mark shifted in his seat, just a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but Emily noticed. She'd learned to notice the smallest changes in Mark, how tension gathered in his shoulders, how impatience crept into his jaw. She noticed it now, the way his body adjusted, the way his foot planted more firmly against the floor. The judge glanced at Emily. "Mrs. Carter," he asked, "is this correct? Is this your father?" Emily swallowed. "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice was quiet, but it carried something new, grounding. Mark's lawyer cleared his throat quickly, eager to reclaim control. "Your Honor," he said, "with all due respect, this case has proceeded according to proper legal protocol. The presence of a family member is not what concerns me," the judge interrupted. His eyes were now on Richard. "What concerns me," the judge continued, "is whether this individual intends to offer legal counsel or evidence that could materially affect this ruling." Richard met the judge's gaze. There was no challenge in his expression, no need to prove dominance. Just certainty. "Yes," he said, "I do." That single sentence landed heavier than any argument Mark's lawyer had made all morning. The judge set his pen down. The sound, soft, controlled, felt final in a way nothing else had. "Then I suggest you take a seat, Mr. Carter," the judge said, "and we'll hear exactly what that is." Richard didn't sit immediately. Instead, he looked at Emily. For a moment, the courtroom disappeared. She was 12 again, standing in a school hallway, backpack clutched tight against her chest. A teacher's voice sharp with accusation. Other students staring, whispering. She remembered how small she'd felt, how unfair the world had seemed. And she remembered how he'd arrived. Not yelling, not demanding, just standing beside her, quiet, solid, the kind of presence that said, "You're not wrong for existing." And somehow, that had always been enough. Richard pulled out a chair beside her and sat, close but not crowding, protective without being possessive. Emily felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was locked so tightly. Mark's confidence cracked, just slightly. It wasn't visible to anyone else, but Emily saw it. Men like Mark relied on silence, on absence, on isolation. And silence had just changed sides. The judge folded his hands. "Mr. Carter," he said, "before we proceed further, I need to clarify your role. Are you seeking to formally represent your daughter, or are you submitting evidence as a third party?" Richard nodded. "I am here in support of her legal counsel," he said, "which will be retained immediately following this recess. However, I do have documentation relevant to the court's understanding of Mrs. Carter's financial stability and medical circumstances." Mark's lawyer stiffened. "Your Honor." "You will have time to respond," the judge said sharply. "Sit down." The room felt different now. Not warmer, not kinder, more balanced. Emily felt the baby move again, stronger this time, a slow stretch beneath her ribs. She placed her hand there, grounding herself. The judge turned back to Richard. "Proceed." Richard reached into his briefcase and removed a neatly organized folder. He didn't fan the papers out, didn't dramatize them. He placed them on the table. My daughter has maintained continuous employment for the last 8 years. She temporarily stepped away due to pregnancy-related complications, which are documented here by her physician. Mark's lawyer stiffened. Your Honor. She also has access to financial reserves, Richard continued, and familial support. She is not financially abandoned, nor is she incapable of providing a stable environment for her child. Emily stared at the table. Not because she was ashamed, but because hearing her life spoken aloud, accurately, respectfully, felt overwhelming. She did not seek to weaponize this support, Richard added. She sought dignity. That word landed differently. Dignity. The judge leaned back slightly, studying Emily with new eyes. Mark finally spoke. This is unnecessary, he said, frustration edging into his voice. We were already following the guidelines. Richard turned to him then, not angrily, not dismissively. Guidelines are a starting point, not a substitute for responsibility. Mark's face flushed. I've done nothing wrong. Richard held his gaze. Doing the minimum is not the same as doing what's right. Silence. Thick. Charged. Emily felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. Not yet. The judge cleared his throat. This hearing will be recessed, he said. When we reconvene, the court will consider additional evidence and revised representation. The gavel struck. This time, the sound didn't feel like judgment. It felt like possibility. As people stood and gathered their belongings, the noise returned gradually, low murmurs, shuffling feet, the hum of life resuming. Mark avoided Emily's gaze as he left. Richard remained seated. Emily turned to him slowly. I didn't want to bother you, she said quietly. Richard looked at her, really looked at her, the exhaustion in her eyes, the strength in her posture, the curve of her stomach. You didn't, he said. You survived. Her composure finally broke, just a little. He reached out, not to pull her close, not to overwhelm her, but to rest his hand gently over hers. You don't have to carry everything alone anymore, he said. Emily nodded, tears slipping free now, and for the first time since the door had closed behind Mark months ago, she believed it. The judge adjusted his glasses. Mr. Carter, he said, before we proceed, I need to know your qualifications. Are you an attorney? Richard smiled faintly. No, Your Honor. Mark exhaled quietly. A mistake. The judge raised an eyebrow. But, Richard continued, unbothered, I have spent the last 30 years working closely with attorneys. Family law, corporate law, contract law. Mark's lawyer stiffened, posture tightening like a drawn wire. Richard didn't look at him. I've testified in courtrooms like this one more times than I can count, Richard went on. Not as a defendant, not as a spectator, but as someone who understands exactly how evidence, leverage, and truth operate within the legal system. The courtroom leaned in, figuratively and literally. Even the spectators sensed it now. This was no longer routine. The judge folded his hands together, studying Richard with renewed interest. Very well, he said. You may proceed. Richard stood, slowly. No rush, no flourish. He reached into his briefcase and removed a thin folder. Not thick, not dramatic, controlled. Emily noticed how steady his hands were. She felt her own heartbeat begin to slow, syncing with his calm. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she wasn't bracing for impact. She was witnessing it. Your Honor, Richard said, this case has been presented as a simple divorce involving a financially dependent wife and a cooperative husband. He turned slightly, just enough to glance at Mark. "That narrative," he said evenly, "is inaccurate." Mark's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection!" "Overruled," the judge said immediately, voice sharp. "I want to hear this." Mark's jaw tightened. Richard opened the folder. "Over the past 6 months, my daughter has documented communications, financial discrepancies, and sworn statements that were intentionally omitted from today's filing." Emily's breath caught. She had gathered those documents alone, late at night, carefully, quietly, never certain she would need them, but unwilling to destroy them either. Richard placed the folder on the bench. "This includes," he said calmly, "evidence of asset concealment, misleading financial disclosures, and written communication that contradicts the petitioner's sworn testimony." The word "sworn" echoed in the room. Mark turned sharply toward his lawyer. For the first time, there was panic. Not dramatic, not explosive, but real. The judge flipped through the pages slowly, very slowly. Each page tightened the silence like a pulled thread. Emily watched his eyes as they moved, watched the way his jaw shifted almost imperceptibly, watched professionalism give way to concern. "Mr. Carter," the judge finally said, tone altered now, firmer, sharper, less patient. "Why was this information not presented earlier?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Emily felt it again, that steady calm. The pause wasn't hesitation, it was control. "Because," said Richard finally, "my daughter believed she could handle this with dignity. She believed the truth would speak for itself." Emily's chest tightened. He paused. "And because she didn't want to turn this courtroom into a battlefield." The judge looked at Emily, not as a case, not as a problem, as a person. Richard met the judge's gaze again. "But I do not share that hesitation." Mark swallowed hard. The sound was small, but in the silence it carried. Richard straightened slightly. "I am not here to attack," he said. "I am here to correct." His voice never rose, never needed to. He turned just enough to face Mark fully. "And to make sure my unborn grandchild does not inherit the consequences of a man's dishonesty." Something inside Mark collapsed. Not loudly, not publicly, internally. Because in that moment, he understood something far too late. This man wasn't bluffing, and this courtroom was no longer under his control. The judge set the folder down, carefully. "This court takes omissions and misrepresentations very seriously," he said, "especially when sworn testimony is involved." Mark's lawyer opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, there was no smooth explanation ready. Richard returned to his seat beside Emily. Didn't touch her, didn't need to. She felt him there like gravity. The judge exhaled slowly. "I am ordering a full financial review," he said. "This hearing will not proceed further today. When we reconvene, the court will expect complete transparency." He looked directly at Mark. "Failure to comply will result in consequences." The gavel came down, harder this time. The sound echoed, not as finality, but as warning. People began to move again, voices low, energy altered. The courtroom that had once felt cold now felt charged, like a storm had passed through and left the air unsettled. Emily remained seated. Her hands were trembling now, not from fear, from release. Richard leaned slightly toward her. "You did everything right," he said quietly, "even when no one was watching." Emily closed her eyes. For months, she had questioned herself, her strength, her choices, her silence. Now, for the first time, she didn't feel foolish for enduring. She felt vindicated. As they stood to leave, Mark walked past them without looking at her. But Emily didn't need him to. She wasn't invisible anymore, and the truth, long ignored, carefully documented, patiently waiting, had finally stepped into the light. The courtroom no longer felt neutral. Something invisible had shifted, like gravity changing direction. What had once been a place of procedure now felt like a place of exposure. Every sound carried farther. Every movement seemed amplified, magnified by the weight of what was unfolding. The judge leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench, eyes fixed on the documents in front of him. "Mr. Carter," he said, now addressing Mark directly, "you've sworn under oath that you disclosed all relevant financial assets. Is that correct?" Mark straightened in his chair. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was firm. Too firm. It was the kind of firmness people used when they were trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. Richard didn't react. He didn't look at Mark, didn't look at the judge. He simply turned one page in the folder. The sound, soft, deliberate, cut through the room. "Your Honor," Richard said calmly, "may I draw your attention to Exhibit C?" The judge nodded once. Richard continued, unhurried. "Exhibit C includes bank statements from an account opened 18 months ago, 6 months prior to the marriage, an account not disclosed in today's filing." Mark's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection! These documents—" "Sit down," the judge said sharply. The lawyer froze. Mid-sentence, mid-breath. Slowly, he lowered himself back into his chair, color draining from his face. The judge turned back to Mark. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, deliberately, "do you recognize this account number?" Mark stared at the paper. Really stared, as if hoping it might change if he looked at it long enough. His throat moved. "Yes." One word. Heavy. "And why was this account not disclosed?" the judge asked. Mark hesitated. The hesitation was brief, but fatal. I didn't think it was relevant." The judge's eyes narrowed. "An account containing over $400,000, he said evenly. "Not relevant?" Silence fell again. Not the quiet kind. The kind that presses inward. Emily felt her heart pounding now, each beat echoing in her ears. Her hands clenched together in her lap, knuckles whitening. She forced herself to breathe slowly. In, out. She had lived with Mark's half-truths for years, the unexplained absences, the vague answers, the careful way he spoke when money came up. She had felt something was wrong. Now she was watching it unravel, piece by piece, in public. Richard spoke again. "This account," he said, "received 3 separate deposits in the past year, each tied to a consulting contract my daughter was never informed about." Emily's breath caught. She hadn't known the amounts, only the tension, the secrecy, the way Mark had grown distant whenever finances were mentioned. The judge exhaled slowly. "Continue." Richard didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "Exhibit D," he said, "contains written communication between Mr. Carter and a third party, discussing the strategic timing of this divorce, specifically to minimize financial exposure before the birth of the child." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, not loud, but unmistakable. The spectators leaned forward now, not out of curiosity, but disbelief. This was no longer a simple divorce. This was something darker, calculated. Mark's lawyer sat frozen. The judge's tone hardened. "Mr. Carter," he said, "are you aware that intentionally misleading this court constitutes perjury?" Mark nodded, barely. "Yes, Your Honor." Emily looked at him, really looked. at the man she had once trusted with her future, with her body, with her child. For the first time since their marriage began to crumble, she didn't feel pain, she felt clarity. She remembered the night he told her he wanted a divorce, how detached he'd been, how controlled, how certain. This had been planned, not the ending, but the advantage. The judge removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the bench. "Mr. Carter," he said, "this court takes sworn testimony seriously. You have presented yourself as cooperative while concealing material information that directly impacts this case." Mark opened his mouth, closed it again. Richard closed the folder, slowly, deliberately. The sound it made, soft paper against leather, was almost insignificant, but in the stillness of the courtroom it felt final, like a period placed at the end of a long, carefully written sentence. He didn't press further, didn't stack evidence on top of evidence, didn't circle back to emphasize what had already landed, because he didn't have to. The truth was no longer fragile, it was standing on its own. The judge removed his glasses and set them down beside the folder. The movement was unhurried, but it carried weight. When he looked up again, his expression had changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. "Mr. Carter," he said, "this court is concerned not just with the omission of assets, but with the intent behind it." The word intent hung in the air. It wasn't an accusation yet, but it was close. The judge turned his attention to Emily. "Mrs. Carter," he said, and his voice softened in a way it hadn't before. "I want you to know that this court recognizes the position you've been placed in." Emily nodded. Her throat tightened, emotion pressing upward, threatening to break through her carefully built composure. Tears gathered, blurring her vision, but they didn't fall. She refused to let them. Not because she was ashamed, but because this moment wasn't about breaking down. It was about being acknowledged. The judge turned back to Mark. "Given the new information presented," he said, "this court is suspending its preliminary ruling." Mark's face drained of color. The confidence he'd walked in with, the certainty that this would all be procedural, predictable, had evaporated completely. His shoulders sagged just slightly, as if something invisible had finally settled onto them. "I am ordering a full financial review," the judge continued, "and appointing temporary legal representation for Mrs. Carter at Mr. Carter's expense." Mark's head snapped up. He opened his mouth, closed it. The silence that followed was telling. There was no argument left that would make things worse. He knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. "This court," the judge added, "will also be reevaluating custody arrangements, spousal support, and future child support obligations based on the totality of evidence." Emily felt her breath catch. Not sharply, gently, like air filling a space that had been collapsed for too long. Richard remained silent. That was the point. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't look at Mark. He simply sat there, composed, hands resting loosely on his knees, as if this outcome had never been in question. The judge looked at him again. "Mr. Carter," he said, "you've shown remarkable restraint." Richard inclined his head slightly. "Truth doesn't require volume, Your Honor." The judge nodded. Once. A small gesture, but one filled with respect. Mark stared at the floor. He finally understood. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about humiliation or public spectacle. This was about consequence, about the difference between what he had planned and what reality demanded. Emily felt something settle inside her. Not victory, not revenge. Safety. A quiet, unfamiliar sense of it. For months, she had lived with a constant undercurrent of fear, of being unseen, unheard, overpowered by a system she didn't understand and a man who had counted on that. Now, for the first time since the ground had shifted beneath her life, she felt steady. The judge struck the gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." The sound echoed, but this time it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a foundation being laid. People stood slowly, conversations sparked and faded, papers were gathered, chairs scraped softly against the floor. Emily remained seated for a moment longer. Her hands rested over her stomach, fingers splayed protectively. The baby moved again, stronger now, more insistent. She smiled faintly. Richard turned toward her. "You did well," he said quietly. She shook her head slightly. "I didn't do anything." He looked at her, really looked at her. "You endured. That's not nothing." They stood together and walked toward the exit. Mark passed them without looking up. Emily watched him go, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a strange kind of detachment. He already felt like someone from another life, a chapter that no longer defined her story. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt brighter, wider, less suffocating. Emily leaned against the wall for a moment, letting the weight of everything catch up to her. Richard stayed close. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," he said. She looked at him. "I didn't ask you to be," she replied softly. "I know. That's why I wish I had come anyway." She nodded. They stood there in silence, not the heavy kind she'd grown used to, but a gentler one, the kind that didn't demand explanation. Emily exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, she believed something, deeply, without hesitation. Her child would be protected, and so would she. The courtroom reconvened 2 weeks later. This time, nothing felt the same. The air itself seemed heavier, as if the room remembered what had happened last time and hadn't quite settled back into neutrality. The benches were filled again, but the quiet was different, less curious, more watchful. Mark sat at the same table, but he wasn't the same man. The confidence he once wore like armor was gone. His shoulders curved inward now, as if he were trying to make himself smaller. His suit still fit, still looked expensive, but it hung differently on him, like a costume that no longer belonged to the role he was trying to play. Fear sat with him. Not panic, not hysteria, something colder, something sobering. Emily sat across from him, but now she wasn't alone. An appointed attorney sat beside her, papers aligned, pen ready. Someone whose presence shifted the balance before a word was spoken. Someone who knew how to translate truth into language the court could not ignore. Richard sat behind her, silent, still, present. Emily didn't turn to look at him, but she felt him there, like a steady hand at her back, reminding her she didn't need to brace herself anymore. The judge entered. Everyone stood. As the proceedings resumed, the judge didn't waste time. There was no small talk, no easing into it. His expression was firm, resolved, the kind that signaled decisions had already been made. "After reviewing the full financial disclosures," he said, "this court finds that Mr. Carter knowingly misrepresented assets and attempted to manipulate the timing of these proceedings to his advantage." Mark's lawyer didn't object. He couldn't. The words had weight because they were measured, because they were backed by documentation, timelines, patterns that told a story Mark could no longer control. "The court further finds," the judge continued, "that Mrs. Carter was placed in an unfair and vulnerable position during this pregnancy." Emily felt her breath catch, not sharply, but deeply, like something inside her had finally been acknowledged aloud. She kept her eyes forward. The judge turned his attention fully to Mark. "Mr. Carter," he said, "this court does not look kindly on dishonesty, especially when it endangers the well-being of a child." Mark swallowed. Hard. "I didn't mean to," he began. The words sounded small, insufficient, as if intention could undo months of calculation. The judge raised a hand. Intent has already been established. The finality in his voice left no room for argument. What followed came calmly, methodically. Not as punishment, but as correction. Full financial transparency, substantial spousal support, primary custody awarded to Emily, strict oversight on future obligations. Each sentence landed without drama, without flourish, and yet each one carried the weight of consequence. Emily listened, one hand resting over her stomach. She felt the baby move again, a slow roll, a gentle press from the inside. Alive, present, protected. She hadn't known how badly she needed to hear those rulings until they were spoken, how deeply fear had burrowed into her, whispering that fairness was optional, that systems favored those who knew how to bend them. Now she felt something else replacing that fear. Relief. Mark stared ahead, unblinking. Not angry, not defiant. Broken. This wasn't just a legal loss. It was the collapse of the story he had told himself, that he was smarter, more prepared, immune to consequence, that he could walk away cleanly, leaving responsibility behind like an item forgotten in a drawer. He realized too late that he had underestimated the one thing he couldn't manipulate: the truth. The judge struck the gavel. "This court expects compliance," he said. "Failure to meet these obligations will result in immediate action." The sound echoed, but not as a threat, as a boundary. People began to rise, papers shuffled, chairs scraped softly against the floor. Emily remained seated for a moment longer. Her attorney leaned in slightly. "It's over," she said quietly. "At least this part." Emily nodded. She stood carefully, one hand braced against the table. Richard moved instinctively closer, not touching, just there. Mark stood as well, but he didn't look at Emily. Not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't. Seeing her now, steady, supported, unbroken, forced him to confront something he had avoided since the beginning. She hadn't needed saving. She had needed truth. Emily turned as she walked toward the exit. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no triumph in hers, no accusation, just clarity. And that, more than anything else, undid him. Outside the courtroom, sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long lines across the floor. Emily paused, letting it warm her face. She exhaled slowly. For months, she had carried the weight of uncertainty alone. Now, standing on the other side of it, she understood something she would carry with her forever. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it simply stands, waits, and lets the truth speak. Her child moved again. Emily smiled softly. The story Mark thought he controlled was over, but hers was just beginning. The courtroom emptied slowly. Not all at once, no rush, no urgency, but in measured fragments, as if everyone needed a moment to recalibrate after what they had witnessed. Shoes scuffed softly against the floor, papers were tucked away, low whispers followed people toward the doors. Emily stayed where she was. She gathered her things carefully, not rushing, Not because she was tired, but because she no longer needed to flee. For months, every movement in her life had been reactive, survival-based, calculated around someone else's decisions. Now, she moved at her own pace. She noticed the way a woman passed her and hesitated, offering a small nod. Another man glanced at her with something like admiration before quickly looking away. These weren't looks of pity. They were something new. Respect. Emily wasn't sure how she felt about it. Being seen always came with vulnerability, but this time it didn't make her shrink. Richard stood a few steps behind her, giving her space without leaving. He understood that some moments had to be navigated alone, even when you weren't alone anymore. When Mark finally approached, his steps were slow, hesitant. The man who once filled rooms with certainty now moved like someone unsure of his footing. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was low, almost careful, as if volume might fracture whatever dignity he had left. Emily looked at him. Really looked. Not at the man he used to be, not at the husband she thought she knew, but at the man standing in front of her now. Smaller, quieter, stripped of the illusion that he could control outcomes without consequence. "You did," she replied quietly. "You just didn't think it would matter." The truth of it landed between them. Mark flinched, not physically, but emotionally, as if the words had found something raw. He turned to Richard next. "I didn't know who you were," he said. Richard met his gaze. Calm. Unyielding. That was never the point. There was no anger in Richard's voice, no satisfaction, just clarity. Mark nodded once, defeated, not because he had lost money or status, but because he had lost the narrative he had lived inside, the one where he was always justified, always a step ahead. He walked away, alone. Emily watched him go, not with triumph, not with bitterness, with release. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter. Not because everything was suddenly easy, but because the tension that had wrapped itself around her lungs for months had finally loosened. Emily stepped into the sunlight. The warmth touched her face, her shoulders, her hands. She exhaled. A long, slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. Richard stood beside her. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. Yes. And she meant it. Not in the way people say it when they're trying to convince themselves, but in the quiet, grounded way that comes from finally feeling safe. A pause stretched between them. "Thank you," she said. Richard shook his head gently. "You didn't need saving," he replied. "You needed backup." Emily smiled. A small one. The kind that doesn't try to impress. The kind that comes after surviving something that reshaped you. They began walking down the courthouse steps together. Not triumphant, not loud, just steady. Emily felt her baby move again, strong, certain. She placed her hand over her stomach. "This was never about revenge," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Richard nodded. "Revenge is loud," he said. "Justice is quiet." She thought about that, about how justice hadn't raised its voice in that courtroom, hadn't humiliated or punished for the sake of spectacle. It had simply corrected the imbalance, held boundaries, protected what mattered. They reached the bottom of the steps. Cars passed by, people moved on with their lives. The world continued, indifferent, unremarkable, real. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt ready to rejoin it. She wasn't walking away with anger. She was walking forward with clarity. Because justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with a door opening at exactly the right moment and the strength to walk through it.